Okay, so yeah, welcome everybody, digitally and physically, to our second lecture in the keynote program of Towards Primary Cultural Institutions, this time by Sour Grass. I'm Nada Schröer, I'm curator based in Cologne, and I'm organizing this event, the summer school Towards Primary Cultural Institutions, together with Anita Roskowska. She is director of CCA Temporary Gallery in Cologne. She sits next to me, and Julia Hamann, of course. She's director of Stiftung Künstlerwerk Schöppingen, where we are right now. This is the place where the summer seminar takes place, and actually where we also, I think you kind of see it in the background a little bit, we are getting tea served, so tea is served to us. It's part of the keynote. I just want to, here, point out the beautiful names. They're called Sprigs of Joy, Foragers, and Wise Woman. So we're drinking tea while having this keynote, and I also invite you, digital participants, to get a cup of tea if you want. So yeah, we're now starting our first day of the summer school, in which we are looking at ecological approaches of different kinds, philosophies, practices that can inform our curatorial practices, artistic practices, and also institutional practices, and yeah, help us kind of to go beyond the rigid structures of institutions that we experience. And it's also a way to find ways to promote reciprocity, material sustainability, a term that we learned about yesterday from Michael Mader. And yeah, a lot of care for our human and modern human collaborators. So because this action and this need for change that we're also talking about a lot in this group is really needed in times of climate crisis right now. And yeah, in this framework, we're gonna have another two other keynotes going on. So all of you also digitally, if you would like to zoom in again on Saturday, we're gonna have a keynote by TJ Demos called Climate Aesthetics as War Class at 2 p.m. Central European Summertime. And then another key lecture by Maya and Ruben Fox about the self-management of plants, I think, yeah, at 9:30 Central European Summertime on Sunday. So a little bit early, but might be worth it. Yeah, so for the discussion after this, of course, there will be possibility to ask questions afterwards, after the lecture. And for that, I would like to ask you physically to raise your hand. So this time we're kind of making a list of names, so we keep the order, let's say. And also in the chat, you can post your questions online via the chat, and then we will collect them here. And but then you can also open your mic and yeah, talk to us directly if you want. And then also turn on your camera that we can see you. Yeah, so I'm gonna introduce Sour Grass. Sour Grass is a curatorial agency founded by Iyawó, Holly Bynoe, and Annalie Davis in 2020, and it's grounded on ethics of witnessing, curiosity, and care. Sour Grass is functioning, and I quote, as a decolonial body and a bridge to activate cultural manifestations of seeding, cross-pollination, germination, cultivation, and harvest, end of quote. So Sour Grass works with artists and creative practitioners from the Caribbean and across its diaspora. And their aim is to establish long-term transnational partnerships with museums and cultural institutions and other cultural practitioners to promote Caribbean contemporary art, literature, discourse, and foster local, regional, transnational cultural exchange. Yeah, Sour Grass is particularly interested in alternative arts pedagogy, discourse programming, and connecting with global worldviews and myths, bringing to life affinities and parallels with the Caribbean. So, and say a little bit more about Iyawó, Holly Bynoe, and Annalie Davis. So Iyawó is an independent curator. She's also a writer and educator, a spiritualist, an earth ally, and researcher from Vincent and the Grenadines. Bynoe is a co-founder of ARC magazine, And she's also co-director of Caribbean Linked, and together with Annalie, co-founder of Tilting Axis, an annual meeting charting arts activism, decolonial methodologies, and models of creative sustainability across the region. So both of you, you're collaborating since quite some time before founding Sourgrass. Yeah, and Annalie is a visual artist, cultural activist, and writer. And her work sits at the intersection of biography and history, focusing on post-plantation economies by engaging with particular landscape of Barbados. And her studio, this is probably really important for her work, is located on a working dairy farm that operated historically as sugarcane plantation. So that offers her critical context for her practice. Yeah, very recently, she exhibited at CCA Glasgow. She also exhibited at Kunsthalle Wien, at Kunsthalle Bratislava, and at the moment, you're working towards an exhibition at Sharjah Biennial, which is and a major commission for the National Trust of Scotland, exploring the historic links between Scotland and Barbados. And you're also founding director of the Fresh Milk Art Platform, and of course, Sourgrass together with Iyawó. And I think without further ado, I hand over to both of you for your lecture, The Grounds We Nurture. Thank you so much for being here. It's really a pleasure that you made all the way to join us here. Thanks so much. We're looking forward.
Thank you, Nada, for a lovely introduction. And I think first, thank you, Yuri, for
So for those of you that have the sprig of joy, it's heather, honeysuckle, lemongrass, St. John's wort, vervain, and wood betony. That's the sprig of joy posse. And for those of you that are having the forages tea, it's bog myrtle, elderflower, meadow sweet, ribwort, and yarrow. And for those that are having the wise woman tea, it's bay leaf, chamomile, lady's mantle, meadow sweet, red clover, and sage. So these were made with a herbalist on the Isle of Skye as part of the National Trust for Scotland project, and I'll share more of that, but I'll hand over to Iyawó. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annalie. Thank you, Nada, Julia and Annetta. Just echoing the sentiments that Annalie shared. We're very, very grateful to be here, to be able to share with you, and many thank yous to Yuri for that first encounter. So this morning, I want to recall the ground that calling on the ancestors and the spirits of Bynoe, St. Vincent, Bekuya, Bekwe, Ichigu Raiman, Barbados. Calling on the spirit of land, the Bahamas, who rose up this knowledge so that I could be here to present this work. Camilo, is there a way for us to see the presentation?
Yes.
Thank you. I've been engaging in an eco-social spiritual practice acutely since 2016, and I would love to share my experiences informed with compassion and embodied knowledge from across communities across several sites within the archipelago of the Bahamas.
I'm sorry, I believe that we are having a problem of sound. Could you turn on your microphone and move a little bit the computer close to them? Because the blue light is on. Yeah, but something with the sun is getting troubles with the mic. Well,
okay. So what must I do?
Move the Nada's computer closer to you and turn it on the computer.
Move the what? Can you?
Yeah. Yes, because could you ask them again?
Can you hear us? Can you hear me? Just write in the chat, please, if you can.
Okay.
Excellent. Wonderful.
That's
Thank
all.
you. No problem. No problem.
Sorry,
No problem. So all of these locations are on the front line of climate change. For some context, the Bahamas is in the North Atlantic Ocean and comprises an archipelago of more than 700 islands with around 30 of them inhabited. The islands have low relief and generally very flat terrain and contain significant wetlands and mangrove forest, with the majority of the population on or near the coast. In fact, about 80% of the land lies less than 1.5 meters above sea level, and as such is very vulnerable to inundation caused by sea level rise and storm surges. The major economic contributor is the services industry, which is largely based on tourism, which accounts for about 90% of the country's GDP. The reliance of the country's economy on tourism and industry supported and reliant on the natural environment makes the country highly vulnerable to climate change and associated natural disaster hazards. To open, I would like to share some words from Adrienne Marie Brown and her work in emergent strategy, shaping change and changing worlds. This book is a kind of a Bible for me. It acts as both lens and root to my viewing of the Caribbean region. She shares, I think it is healing behavior to look at something so broken and see the possibility and wholeness in it. In April 2019, my first spiritual descent into a cave in the heart of Barbados, guided by the indigenous knowledge systems bound in the philosophies of animism, as taught by the Dagara cosmology or worldview, which is a region located in the upper regions of the Volta River in Burkina Faso and Ghana, changed my life. For context, I wanted to just give a working definition of animism that I feel very instructive for me. And this comes from Peggy Ayers, who engages in ethnocultural recovery and rewilding. And she shares, animism is the way humanity has been deeply connected to the land, its seasonal cycles for millennia, in rapport and conversation with the animals, plants, elements, ancestors, and earth spirits. The opposite of animism is the cult of the individual, so celebrated in modern society. And the loss of the animist worldview is at the root of our spiritual disconnect and looming ecological crisis. Human beings are just one strand woven into the complex systems of the earth community. And the animist perspective is fundamental to the paradigm shift and the recovery of our own ancestral wisdom. So this descent into the cave was very spiritual, but outside of that, it was urgent for me. I emerged and I started to commune in fellowship with the wisdom of plants through the mammy apple, the passion flower, and the flamboyant. I sought to understand my connection to Mother Earth and the spirit of the elemental forces that govern the seen and unseen worlds. And this all provided me with a very embodied experience to return to my then role as chief curator at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas to find a courageous heart to move through the process of letting go and stepping into a graceful exit. These plant allies during the following months were companions and gave me a way to think through motivations around groundedness, intentionality, community, and sisterhood. It clarified what it meant to be an outlier, a change agent in an unhealthy cultural ecosystem, a space where inherited colonial legacies and vestiges threaten the very act of being, belonging, and creating. And of course, over the past days, we've been sharing very resonant and very personal stories about being caught up in the disease or the disease of institutions, riddled with toxicity, injustice, white patriarchal underpinnings, which lay threat to our bodies, psyches, communities, and like any true infection, it lays waste and death to the host itself. And I quite like the analogy of infection as defined by the late Cuban-born American visual artist Felix Gonzalez Torres, who said, "I want to be like a virus that belongs to the institution. All the ideological apparatuses are, in other words, replicating themselves, because that is the way the culture works. So if I function as a virus, as an imposter, as an infiltrator, I will always replicate myself together with those institutions." Sometimes I wonder if Felix considered his virus potential as medicine, as curative. These ways of being and infection are typical of government-run establishments across the Caribbean, and I think maybe across the world, given the conversations that we've been having here. But in this space of ascension, out of the cave, out of the toxicity, I was given an opportunity to see something other than a crisis. I tapped into the wisdom of the plant allies and kindred to think through a strategy of care and courage, to cover myself in as I made my decision to leave that place. I used the salve of the plants to bring new guidance, to care for my team, my colleagues, friends, and compatriots, along with members of the wider community who are growing increasingly distrustful, many feeling unable to form or come into the right relationship to a place that for the most part was seen as part of the colonial machinery. And within that outlier space, being on the periphery and perhaps beyond the periphery, aided by medicine and the ancestors, I decided to actively become a part of the decolonizing machinery in ways that I was not before. In contexts like ours, institutional machinery should always be subverted towards decolonial purposes. As publics who are confronting the violence of underdevelopment daily, it is a part of our unconscious ability and toolkit. This for me was stoked at a very, very early age, listening to Kaiso, or like indigenous song of certain regions across the Caribbean, and reading the literature emerging out of the archipelagic rhizome. I took a lot of instruction from Derek Walcott, who argued that the Caribbean region does not offer an easy unified articulation of sameness through difference, but rather a space where constant negotiation of particularities, extending outward from colonial brutalities, produces an ethics of being yet to come. Malian cultural theorist and filmmaker Manthia Diawara, who was invited keynote to Tilting Axis 5, which was held a few weeks after my ascent from the cave in Guadeloupe, outlined the ways in which Caribbean cultural workers can imagine our space in a different way. He stressed that our efforts to decolonize will only be successful through understanding our shared challenges and connecting with each other on the deepest levels, artistic, social, and otherwise. And Edouard Glissant argues that the essence of colonization is to disconnect people from themselves, which is the original void wound of separatedness, which can only be countered by efforts such as introspection, connecting, by creating safe spaces to explore our affinities, to provoke intimacies, and to find solidarity, and above all, to remember the shared spiritual roots, ancestors, and histories from which we were violently ripped. At the center of this transmission was subversion, self-regulation, and care, and I became more devoted than ever in my role to provide room for rupture, compassionate listening, and tending. L.A. Paperson in A Third University is Possible shared, and I quote, "The bits of machinery that make up decolonizing knowledge spaces are driven by decolonial desires with decolonizing dreamers who are subversively part of the machinery and part machine themselves. These subversive beings wreck, scavenge, retool, reassemble decolonizing knowledge space into decolonizing contraptions. They are cyborgs with a decolonizing desire. Cyborgs are part ghost, part orphan. I chose then to be one of them. For context, the museum was founded in 2003 and was in its second directorship and faced an institutional crisis of not understanding its function internally or externally. Within this scenario, systemic injustice played out much like the ways that we see it being reported through wider feeds, reels, and broadcasts. The internal ruptures and injustices continued to be ignored while the nation was collectively staring down the eye of an historic and catastrophic Category 5 hurricane. On September 1st, 2019, as Hurricane Dorian neared the Abaco Islands and stalled over Grand Bahama, moving at a speed of 0.5 miles per hour for 48 hours. Our collective breaths were shallow, grasping, and disconnected from our bodies. Just for some context and to note, several of the family islands in the Bahamas are among the top ranking of islands affected most by tropical storms and hurricanes. In fact, Grand Bahama has been hit 93 times since 1871. And there were several Category 4 and 5 hurricanes during my tenure in 2015, 16, 17, and 19. Joaquin, Matthew, Irma, and Dorian affected and decimated populations, biodiversity, and infrastructure across Long Island, New Providence, Andros, Ragged Island, Acklands, Crooked Island, Inagua, Bimini, the Abacos, and Grand Bahama. For Caribbean people, at some point in our development, the automatic, evolutionary, and instinctual conditioning takes over to ensure that we can emotionally sustain ourselves during worsened hurricane season, sea level rise. And as we grieve the disappearance of mangroves, primary forests, medicinal plants, and all around biodiversity and animate life forms. So we gathered our collective breath to issue prayers for the unsafe national collections and the cultural patrimony stored in basements and within limestone halls, whose structures shake and sweat with every millibar pressure drop. We look regionally at our national cultural foundations and historic museums and other spaces of patrimonial interest blown onto the precipice of lost time. And most achingly, we hear the story of artists watching their work, their livelihoods, and for some people, their family, loved ones, and neighbors being washed away in waves. As people from low-lying territories in the developing world, we wake every day to the dawning of the end and acknowledge the important role that Mother Nature plays in calling us to be reminded of our purpose. And this call felt so acute during Dorian's landfall. When we were in that moment of collective trauma, the institution, despite its rumblings and disease and its rampant infection, we were forced to stop. And then, like birds within a murmuration, or like the ancestral cucumber with its wispy tendrils, we moved knowing that we were granted time outside of the eye of the storm to access safety for self and family and communities across the islands, to rally community support, to solicit a call and response from local partners who had more disaster management capacity and experience, and most importantly, to contest the institutional hierarchy in order to effectively make a decision to benefit the community within and during recovery and not the institution. What happened then was a temporary seizure of power in the form of a gathering with leadership to speak through past misuse and abuse of resources and blind spots regarding the real needs of the affected communities, rather than resorting to the speculative white savior needs, which often typifies disaster management schemes in Black spaces. Even though the museum tried to communicate safe space and shelter to those in the downtown area of Nassau, its location on the border of the nation's navel of Grantstown, which is a historically significant community and also one of the most underserved areas of New Providence, was seen as very problematic. The surrounding community saw a colonial architecture, increased gentrification, white elite directorship and leadership, and a historical villa sitting at the top of the hill with a very contested history. They saw a space that was not for them. However, there was more sitting on the expanded campus of the institution, something buried, something ancestral, something embodying the wisdom and the technologies directly related to our healing. A historic ancestral hospital turned medicinal garden. So the first documented hospital in the Bahamas and one of the earliest in the Caribbean, known as the African Hospital, sits atop of West Hill Streets at the intersection of Hospital Lane, which comprises the northeastern part of the NAGB's property. This was first identified in a 1788 map of Nassau. The hospital's property became a part of the NAGB's campus in 2016. And while its exact opening date is unknown, the hospital serviced the Black population of New Providence for approximately 50 years. According to research put forward by Tira Novlu, a Bahamian South African art historian, it is unclear why the hospital opened, as Bahamian slaves were considered healthier than most in the Caribbean, in part to a wholesome diet and the absence of rigor on the sugar plantation. One possibility is that loyalists brought established medical practices from the US, and particularly plantations in the US, the south of the US, to the Bahamas in the late 1780s. The more likely possibility lies in the increasing European interest in developing modern medicine. Following the rise of empiricism in the 17th century, European physicians began to seek out large populations to gain experience and knowledge of effective medical practices. Those enslaved in Caribbean colonies were ideal experimental groups to lead bioprospecting endeavors. The enslaved brought across the Black Atlantic ancient technologies of remedies, potions, spiritual practices, and rituals that work in concert with land and spirit. From worldviews shaped by animism, the ancestors who occupy these spaces practiced with known bush medicines, learned new species on arrival with help from spirit, the indigenous population and their bloodlines, to call to life several new cosmologies and practices that have since then been under the threat of erasure. These indigenous knowledge systems are now asprawl across the Caribbean, some sharing root affinities with cosmologies that are nebulous, beyond definition, and in the arms of spirit. Lukumi, Regla de Ocha, Santeria, Obia, Kumina, Voodoo, Winti, Revival, Orisha, Hodu, Kumfa, Palomonte, Palomayombe, Candomblé, Yoruba, Mayal, Poco, Zion, Convince, and there are many more. And I come before you today as Iyawó, a newborn, deepening my relationship with spirit and the alive world in the tradition of Lukumi, a Yoruba spiritual technology that did cross the Black Atlantic. The site of the hospital and garden became a place for deep reflection, meditation, and instruction for me. As I was dealing with the grief of letting go of a space and leaving a place that became home, while watching a stalwart art institution, one that I was proud of, enter into slow toxic poisoning, I sat in reflection and co-creation with plant medicine and brought forth some points of consideration, which were later platformed at the temporary seizure of power to speak about the institutional response to Dorian. They include, what can be built beyond architecture to buttress material and immaterial loss? How can we move beyond the language of resiliency as resilience requires time for integration. And like every closed system, this moment for resiliency can't be forced. It can't be coerced. It can't be missed. And my question is integration possible during annual assault? What steps can we take to ensure mutuality while steeped in the toxic vestiges of colonialism? How do institutions take care of the weary, lost, and orphaned? How do they resource staff to learn from organizational patterns, good and bad, in order to build strengths with the human and non-human worlds? How do cyborgs, agitators, and kin continue to resource themselves within and outside of the space so that we can self-regulate in order to feed information back into the wider cultural ecosystem, becoming more trauma-informed and adaptable? How can local embodied knowledge, the ecologies of our surrounding communities, human, plant, and other, nurture new systems of institutional knowledge? Together, we casted a vote to care for our communities in a way that was very different by devising a campaign to address mental health, wellness, and disassociation across our low-lying island spaces. This came to life through the co-creation of the Civic and Healing Psychosocial Initiative, Sanctuary After the Storm. And it was developed to support New Providence-based communities and those affected in Grand Bahama and the Abacos with access to alternative modes of healing through art therapy, individual and family counseling sessions, public fora, wellness and meditation workshop, and the more esoteric energy medicine work in collaboration with plant allies. This initiative highlighted the critical engagements that region-based institutions and Caribbean nations struggle with, while illuminating the need for care and love-centered modalities, intimacy and social mediation. And what unfolded over the course of 2 months was nothing short of a miracle, because within our communities, we were able to co-facilitate healing methodologies that offered those impacted a sense of belonging, normalcy, relief, and respite. We found a way to self-regulate while communing with each other. And this started with an open invitation to mental health professionals and social workers to collaborate with the institution. And 7 lead professionals were able to facilitate an open forum to detail a short-term program for the aftermath of recovery. And this meeting was illuminating, and the campaign that followed was unprecedented for museums in the Caribbean. In smaller working groups, we were able to address crisis management. We had open therapy blocks for families. And of course, all of these services were also offered on-site, off-site, at shelters, and throughout the family islands that were affected. We held open mic sessions and drumming nights, which invited those across shelters, in particular the displaced Haitian and Haitian Bahamian population, to gather at the site of the African Hospital and the garden to storytell, to nourish, to release and play. Children and youth were at the center of our outreach. The institution collaborated with chefs, store companies, the University of the Bahamas, and a collective of activists, muralists, artists, and musicians who were able to move from New Providence to Ground Zero to amplify hopeful images and social programming across broken sites of unprecedented loss. These were coupled with wellness Sunday sessions with mindfulness meditation and yoga, along with programming specifically geared towards younger children. We worked with a Grand Bahama resident who is a Scottish art therapist, and she was able to devise a plan of care and recuperation for youth called Create Space. And just for some context, the Bahamas has a very problematic and layered, contested, shared historic and social history with Haiti, one steeped in xenophobia, classism, self-hatred, and exile. Since most of the displaced were Haitian, this gave the institution room to think about points of access and its relationship to the growing climate refugee crisis, allyship, and provisioning for more inclusion and more national safe space, offering non-discriminatory services. And of course, naturally, Bahamians living in the diaspora and other Caribbean people reached out to us to see what they could contribute during this time. And one of the most welcoming and generative collaborations came in the form of Healing Hands Bahamas, a trio headed by Bahamian poet and shamanic practitioner Helen Clinares, who was accompanied by Patricia Powell and craniosacral therapist Tommy Kunston. They transformed exhibition spaces into healing rooms to facilitate the laying of hands, and over 2 weeks, they had trained on-the-ground practitioners who had previous energy medicine skills to retool and accompany them to work across these shelters. And this culminated in a public lecture and in a compassionate listening circle and within a community workshop titled Imagining Refuge and Resiliency, for sharing where the displaced, their families, and others in need were able to be with community, be held in safety with their community, be in witness to each other's voices. The museum's usual demographic comprises about 70% foreign visitors, with local numbers growing wearily but steadily from 2010 onwards. And annually, they welcome between 6,000 and 9,000 people. Sanctuary After the Storm ran for 2 months, and its programming impacted the lives of 2,000 people, 90% of them never having entered the museum's campus prior to these offerings. It opened the door to have conversations around the offering of small, non-dependent grants to artists, along with providing affordable studio spaces, and heralded the first climate resilient open call to support works by Bahamians who were displaced, moved, and or affected by Dorian. This exhibition was entitled Refuge, and it was the last exhibition that I curated before I left the institution. So what knowledge did Sanctuary After the Storm deliver to the institution for us to review its inner workings and ways of being? Firstly, be in context with your care. Develop practical and theoretical engagements that rekindle old knowledge and skills to help communities reimagine their places as climate change prepared. Acknowledge that the technologies available to our ancestors are also in relationship with us through dreaming and through our bloodlines. Understanding how to contextually adapt this knowledge within our own bodies can cultivate joy, healing, and routes to emancipation. Secondly, honor interconnectedness. Recognizing the interconnectedness of human beings with the many other than human beings will revitalize learning systems. This interconnectedness between all life will end the lack of the respect for diversity. Interconnect knowledge systems across communities. The role and value of embodied knowledge as a method of re-engagement can bring local people, community organizations, and partners together into an open learning environment to develop ways of adapting to climate change. And think about ecosystem of relationality like the deep floor of the ocean or forest, where there are hundreds of thousands of unknown species with elevated knowledge systems that we can learn from. Big thank you to Alexis Peskin-Gums for her meditation on the adaptability of mammals. Rest. Determine when the ground you're upon needs rest. Think about the institution like fallow land. Know when it is rewilding, when new species are emerging, what is of benefit or of threat. Without this time to observe and determine what's there, you might be plowing over and destroying fertile seeds for tomorrow. My ancestors had a rule of resting the land and their bodies during the 7th year. And after hearing Yuri speak yesterday about the DNA and the genome, the information embedded in the seeds lasting for 7 generations, and elders from various traditions, indigenous and otherwise, calling up the knowledge lineage moving 7 generations forward and backward, I'm even more interested in understanding how this folkway became embedded in my culture. Make healthcare mandatory. Provide mental health days, add flexible time to the working structure, ensure that you continue to look and challenge late-stage capitalism and its effect on everyone connected to the institution, staff, families, and all community members. Breed polycultures, a lesson learned from emergent strategy. Work through affinities by breeding polycultures and intersectionalities. Cultivate mutuality, and we can, this lesson was taught in a very, very beautiful way by the knowledge of the 3 sisters. The 3 inseparable sisters, corn, bean, and squash, can only thrive when grown together. And heal the severed relationship that we have with the land and the damage of colonialism by directly funding psychosocial programs for youth and efforts linked to food and medicine security, because they too need to see and realize polycultures of their own. And finally, nourish and welcome the death cycle. The role of organizers within an ecosystem is to be like earthworms, processing, aerating, making fertile ground for nutrients of energy, the elements and everything that dies, including us, to nurture the next life cycle. And this will create new economies of relationships, a new society of care and respect. And no creative project endeavor, regardless of function, needs to last forever. Walk into sunsetting, to succession planning, and dissolving gracefully. My curatorial practice has hinged on the ethic embedded in the wisdom and caring, which was exemplified in this project. Listening to the local community to ensure that needs are listening to the local community and to ensure that needs are integrated and not speculated was key to this venture. And the wisdom in Sanctuary drastically shifted my relationship to the climate emergency and the legacy of compounded trauma and the need for support mechanisms to combat the exponential dread across the Caribbean. And I continue to work with the wisdom of plant allies in multiple ways through something called La Dieta, which is what shamanic practitioners are often called to do when they initiate into working with the plant. They kind of sit in a diet with the plant medicine for a very, very long time. And the ways of knowing move beyond the rational. So we walk into the plant, we find companionship, and the plant becomes integrated and it develops a relationship with us. I have so many experiences to share and very little time today, but I just want to call two of them up, the Vincidor, the Vitex, and the Jimson weed or the Datura, both poison, both medicinal, both dealing with death and the rising of the feminine. And over the last 2 years, I've deepened my eco-social and spiritual relationship with 2 gardens. One of them failed, but was very instructive, and the other in process. And I'm currently working on a TEK and intergenerational archival project called Bush Medicine, which is funded by the Prince Claus Fund and the Goethe Institute under their call for artistic responses to environmental change on my 7-square-mile home island of Bynoe, which is located in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which has a population of 5,000, so a little less than the village here. As generator and healer at the Hub Collective, which is a social arts NGO, we're building my island's first ecological medicinal community garden using the techniques of permaculture, but maybe epistemologies beyond permaculture to regenerate Bynoe's soil, while using the site as a space to expand medicinal biodiversity on the island and heal trauma and ruptures that the community has with the land due to our colonial history. To guarantee that this garden aids in biodiversity, we're working with permaculture experts, and we're going to plant this garden, which is about twice the size of the garden outside, with perennial species, a lot of bush medicine, and we also have plans to erect a plant nursery. We want to do an ancestral seed exchange, and it is going to be the first community space aiding in diversifying the ecological services on this very water scarce island. BMR uses elder storytelling towards community healing via the recovery of TEK. And weekly we share information on bush medicines through illustrations, reports from elders, and field images, which make the plants identifiable to our wider community. This information will live in a handbook via a website and will be launched at the end of the year and across the site as a community mural project. And the garden is located in a very special space. It is in the capital of Port Elizabeth, close to churches, schools, and most places of business. And throughout the year, we will be having several permablitz and composting workshops. And we planted our living fence in May, and I'm happy to report that it's coming along very, very nicely. Through this project, we have engaged with elders to produce a mini documentary highlighting heritage stories and a series of conversations in collaboration with Bynoe's most vulnerable demographic. That's my mom on the top left. These activities will feed into a deeper reciprocal relationship activating the dwindling community spirit that once placed our island on the global map. And to end, and in reflection, I am ever thankful for the descent into the cave, for the ascension, for the medicines that the passion flower gave to my dreaming, for the clarification that the flamboyant brought to my voice and intention setting. And finally, I give thanks to the Mammy Apple with its queen of the forest indigenous magic, which took care of my rooting back to the ancestors. And all of this work is dedicated to my great-grandmother, Iris, who tended the land daily, grew her food, lived to be at 104, so I got to know her, and who comes to me frequently in dreams, letting me know what is infection and what is indeed medicine. Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much to share your work and your deep engagement with environment, with histories, with community, with questions of justice and climate change through your really central and embodied practices that take the form of healing, of various forms of healing actually. And maybe this is also, well, maybe first of all, we open up before. I have one question in mind, but first of all, I would like to see if there are already any questions in the digital audience or the physical audience.
The kind of new way of working at the Institute you left, I was wondering, is there a continuation of that work, or what's your feeling towards leaving something that you, that is such an important thing to do? And then, I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
That's a really interesting question, Yuri. Thank you. I had to figure out how to draw a boundary, and that took a very long time. I feel as though even though I was not like physically with the institution, that like my emotional space and energy space was still with my team for quite some time, because they were also in distress. But I was in distress. So that parameter, I think, became a lot more solid about 1.5 years after I exited. So the infection continued. Yes, and the director left. They hired a new chief curator who lasted for 6 months. The team turned over, as was the case prior to 2015. And the board became dissolved earlier this year. So I think that this medicine or this methodology and this moment of exchange gave the actual structure of the space a lot to think about. And that's why it became almost impossible for the unhealth and the disease to continue. So we're waiting to see what's going to take shape, how the ecology of the institution can find a new balance that works for the new team. And there's been a lot of erasure within that moment from like 2017 on to 2019, the like actual erasure within the archive, meaning they built a new website and a lot of information disappeared. So I feel that there's a lot of like embedded shame within the space in terms of people knowing the disease and people knowing how toxic it became, because we were very vocal. And I'm hoping that there are some lessons learned. I'm hoping that they can figure out a way to bring health back into the space and perhaps use all of the tools that surrounds the institution as well to inform whatever that new structure is. I don't have a lot of hope for Caribbean institutions. Oh, I don't, because even though we are in like revolution and awakening, I'm so entrenched in the vestige that it's going to take a lot more than just this moment of crisis. So we'll see, we'll see, we'll see. I mean, that sounds really bad that I don't have any hope, but it's really the truth because it makes everything so sick. I hope that the people who are coming in can engage in a way that could drop more medicine in. But if we follow history and the history of the space itself, I'm hoping that like the ancestral tools from that African hospital can do something to this new kind of assemblage of psyche. Yeah. Thank you, Yuri.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.